Welcome to Core and Bath Conversations, a podcast series dedicated to adoption, fostering and kinship care. We ask children's social care professionals and experts by experience to join us to share with us and you, our listeners, their experiences, reflections and knowledge. I hope you enjoy.
Okay, welcome to another episode of the Core and Bath Adoption and Fostering Journal podcast. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome not one but two guests to our podcast today, Morvwen Duncan and Hetty Verhagen. Morvwen authored an article in our upcoming Adoption and Fostering Journal issue, together with Pascal Fearon and Matt Wilger. The title of the study is A Qualitative Exploration of How Adoptive Parents Experience the Direct and Indirect Trauma of their child's early maltreatment. And the findings of this study actually discuss the topic of child-to-parent violence and also inspired the editorial for the upcoming issue, which is volume 49, issue 2. So my second guest today is the lovely Hetty Verhagen, or Hetty. Hetty is a therapeutic social worker and wrote a book on the topic of child-to-parent violence. Her book is available at the Core and Bath bookshop. And after this shameless product placement, could you both please briefly introduce yourself to our listeners? Hetty, if we start with you.
Hello. Yes, I'm a therapeutic social worker. I'm a little bit of an anomaly as a social worker because I've only ever worked in adoption and fostering services. I went straight into a local authority adoption support team when I qualified as a social worker, and then I went on to be part of the small team that set up the Centre for Adoption Support at Adoption Matters. I'm now an independent therapeutic social worker. I do mainly work funded by the Adoption Support Fund, and I'm also a lecturer in social work at the University of Leeds.
Fantastic. Morvwen, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Morvwen. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my background is mainly specialising with children, young people and their families. My background was mainly in adoption and fostering, which is where the research came from and my research interest. I'm now still working within the NHS, so I lead a forensic child and adolescent mental health team, and my own private practice too, the Lotus Psychology Practice.
Hey, fantastic. So, Morvwen, could you summarise the aim of this study and maybe the main kind of findings for our listeners?
Yeah, so this paper in particular was part of a wider research project. So there were two kind of main phases, a quantitative and a qualitative study. So their kind of overall aim was to explore both the direct but indirect experiences of trauma for adoptive parents. So direct kind of relating to their experiences as a parent, so witnessing, for example, deliberate self-harm or experiencing child-to-parent violence, and indirect or secondary trauma, the impact of hearing about the experiences of their child's trauma or adverse early experiences. So I guess the findings of the qualitative part of the study was really to give a voice to the adoptive parents. And these were parents that had, on a screening measure, had high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder or trauma. And the findings really were that there was such a significant impact for these parents on trauma. So the knowledge of what their child had been through, but predominantly the child-to-parent violence and their experiences as a parent, which led to lots of trauma symptoms themselves, so lots of hypervigilance to threat, feelings of unsafety, and avoidance of reminders. And that was, I guess, kind of the main finding was just the impact of child-to-parent violence on these parents and families.
So it's fair to say, so the sample you set out to recruit was quite a distressed sample to begin with, right? Because you decided on who to recruit based on the PTSD symptoms they displayed, right? Or presented with.
Yeah, exactly right. So the first part of the study was a large kind of survey to look at what are some of the quantitative rates of PTSD or trauma. And we found that 10% of parents experienced symptoms that were on a screening measure probable of diagnosis of PTSD. So really high rates of distress. And we purposely sampled from those parents that had high symptoms of trauma.
10% seems quite high as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, much higher than the general population.
Yeah. Interesting. From what I understand from going through your study, the topic child-to-parent violence came up as a bit of a surprise or as an unexpected finding.
Yeah. We thought a lot about the impact of parenting a child with adverse experiences, and that kind of came from our clinical experiences. So my colleague Matt working in the national adoption team, and my own experiences in adoption teams of parents that the focus being on their child's experiences in services. But actually what kind of came up was really it was about their own direct experiences too, which often feels like it's missed within services.
And then I highlighted some of the quotes just to maybe give our listeners an idea of what kind of experiences we are talking about. And I should maybe stress that the 3 quotes are from 3 different participants, so it's reflecting experiences across different people. So the first one is, "I remember lying in my bed and thinking, is he going to come in here and kill me?" Second one, which is in a similar vein, is, "I've thought we could quite easily end up as newspaper headlines from her having killed me, or her or both of us in some way, shape or form because she is angry." And last one, "She talks a lot about making me bleed, cutting me. It's about being on high alert and thinking what could go wrong." So what struck me was these are quite serious kind of worries and examples, right? Because I thought sometimes when you think of child-to-parent violence, where does it start? At which point do we say this is kind of child-to-parent violence? So how was it for you listening to those stories?
Really, really challenging. And I think partly because we hadn't expected the extent of the child-to-parent violence that came up. But it was really, really powerful to listen to these parents talk through their experiences and really emotive. And I think those quotes really show the level of distress that these parents are managing, that they're living with every day. That really, really powerful quotes.
Hetty, when you listen to those quotes, do these match your experience of when you're talking to parents who experience these things? Is that the kind of examples that resonate with you?
Absolutely. Actually, when I read the study, I felt that I almost recognised some of the people that I've worked with over the years in the descriptions and in the quotes. Really, everything I was reading, I was thinking, oh, that's like this family, that's like that family. Yeah, absolutely. Because my area of real interest is working with families who experience child-to-parent violence. That is most of the work that I do, and these are the stories that I hear time and time again from parents. And it is, some people are living very difficult lives. We also have to remember, of course, that the children are experiencing, that the behaviour comes from the trauma that they've experienced earlier on in their lives. So it's the whole family that suffers with child-to-parent violence, not just the parents.
Maybe the question is, where does it start? So at what time, where would we say this is now child-to-parent violence and this goes beyond, like, don't know, for example, a toddler hitting their parent when they are very angry, when they're having a tantrum? They would probably say that is expected behavior during that age, right? But where do we draw the lines, or where do children kind of cross the line maybe into child-to-parent violence? What would you say?
I think if we look at the different definitions of child-to-parent violence, the definitions that I find really helpful are the ones that pick up on the fact that it's when the behaviour and the fear, the threat of what might happen actually changes parents' behaviour. So they feel they can't parent the way they'd like to parent because of threat of violence or for not wanting to upset the child and cause an incident. I think when parents feel that they're walking on eggshells a lot of the time, I think that's when we're talking about child-to-parent violence and aggression.
So basically so a little bit defined by the effect it has on parents and caregivers?
Yes, I think it is that different feeling, because a lot of the conversations that I have with parents, they might say, well, I talk to other parents who had children through birth, and they say things like, oh, my child does that. Oh, they all say these things, they all do these things, but it feels different. The intensity, the frequency, the duration is different. I don't know whether you felt the same, Morvwen, when you did your interviews?
Yeah, I'm nodding along like a lot to what you're saying there. I think we had a theme that came up around parents' kind of own sense of identity as a parent, and that was one of the things that came up. The parent who they had hoped to be and the parent they wanted to be versus kind of where they felt they were at now too was a really, really big theme about the impact of not only on them but on them as a parent that they wanted to be.
And I think in the definitions I read through, because some I think focus more on like really the physical violence aspect, but I think there are some more broader ones that also take into account kind of more emotional types of violence or even financial types of adversity in a way. So kind of much broader definition. So that also what you see, that we have that is not because the term child-parent violence kind of suggests the focus on the physical aspect, but it doesn't have to be only that, right?
No, and that's why I chose in the book that I wrote for Graham Bath, and that's why I chose to use the term child-to-parent violence and aggression to kind of broaden it out, because often parents talk about that walking on eggshells feeling and almost feeling controlled or bullied in their own home. But then they might say, but this is not child-to-parent violence because my child's not hitting me, my child's not biting me, but it's this atmosphere in the home of control. Yeah, so I think that aggression bit for me is important to include.
It's similar when we're talking about childhood maltreatment, right? Because then we have physical abuse, but then we have also emotional abuse, which is much harder to define properly, right? Because it feels less tangible in a way. It's harder to define. But I think it's interesting to see, well, it's about when that kind of feeling changes, something is off or not how it's supposed to be. What would you say from your experience? What are the kind of common examples you're hearing across when about from parents affected by child-parent violence?
I think what I often hear is kind of dysregulation that escalates and then lasts a long, long time. So I think often when we think of these things, like when you mention a toddler that hits their parent or a child that becomes angry, that tends to be almost like a snapshot. But the stories that I hear, it can go on for hours and hours. It can escalate. For example, a child's playing outside. It's time for them to come in, have their bath, go to bed. And it can escalate from there and go on till like 11, 12 o'clock at night. And bedrooms may be trashed, belongings smashed, lots of noise, lots of screaming, just dysregulation for extended periods of time.
It's also something quite tiring for the child, right? So it must be quite exhausting.
Absolutely, yes. And then you can get into a cycle, because obviously afterwards, when the child is either that exhausted that they fall asleep, or when they calm down, then there's the shame, there's the guilt, there's, oh my gosh, what have I done? They may see, the bruises the next day on the parent's arms or legs. They'll see the things that they've broken, and you get that shame and exhaustion. And that is obviously another risk factor, that if something goes wrong for a child who can't manage those kind of vulnerable emotions. So that's the way that I look at child-to-parent violence and aggression, that for a child who, because of their early experiences, feels really severely threatened by vulnerable emotions like fear, rejection, sadness, the anger kind of comes in as a shield, because anger makes you feel quite powerful, while these vulnerable emotions make you feel small and at risk. So if a child is in that state where they feel very ashamed, very, very exhausted, and then something else happens which makes them feel vulnerable, you might get that cycle of child-to-parent violence and aggression. So parents often talk to me about, we've had a good week, or we've had a terrible week, or, it's not one incident often. It can get quite big. And for some families, they feel that they have to phone the police because there's just no calming things down, and it starts to feel very dangerous, not just for the parents, but for the child themselves as well.
Does some of that resonate with you, Morvwen, from your interviews?
Absolutely. There's kind of, on one hand, knowing their child's early experiences and the impact that that's had on the child means that these parents are developing greater empathy, greater understanding of their child and their experiences, and understanding the behaviour in context to their experiences. But that kind of shame that you were talking about there, Hetty, a child feels and then the parent feels. There is parents that would talk about feeling like a failure because of their child's the behaviour, the challenges, and that sense of isolation, being alone in managing these challenges and at home.
I felt like also from the literature that's a bit of a taboo topic, isn't it? To talk about, oh, my child displays violent behaviours towards me, or I'm afraid of my child sometimes, right? I imagine it's quite a hard thing to talk about. Did that come across in your interviews, Morvwen, as well, when this topic came up?
Absolutely, that sense of comparing themselves to other parents or to the parents they hope to be and the experiences they perhaps hope to have as a parent, that make it incredibly difficult to talk about experiencing violence at home. And there were some parents that kind of likened it to domestic violence, and that experience of feeling fear in the home, and that being incredibly difficult to talk about to other people and other parents as well.
And what are the policy and practice recommendations from your findings? So it's good that we have them. It's good that the parents talked about it. What do we do now?
I think that's a really, really good question. And I wish I had all the answers about what to do to support these families. I think one of the big things is raising awareness of child to parent violence. There's really not a lot of research on it, which is why, when we were speaking before, I was really excited to hear this as a whole editorial piece of research, which adds to that sense of isolation for these families. And one of the big factors that came up was that social support, and parents really, really valuing other adoptive parents' experiences within their network. So I think kind of helping families to feel less alone, to feel less isolated in managing these challenges. And I think in terms of clinical implications, thinking about services screening for trauma in parents. So we focus a lot on the child's trauma, which is absolutely, we should be continuing doing that. We focus on supporting parents with behavioural strategies, ways to manage the behaviour at home, but recognising that actually there's the parents as well own mental health and well-being that needs a lot more focus. So things like screening and services for PTSD or trauma responses for adoptive parents, as well as the children too, to support them more widely as a family.
Hetty, what are your thoughts on kind of policy and practice implications from this type of research?
I absolutely agree with Morvwen. We need lots of training and awareness raising. I think, interestingly, over the past years, child-to-parent violence and aggression has become, in my impression, slightly less stigmatized within the adoptive community, because I think there are really helpful advocates and people on social media who write about this, who kind of connect adoptive parents together. But still, I think we need to start talking about this from the very beginning, when people first come forward as prospective adopters. In the organisation that I'm attached to, the Centre for Adoption Support, a workshop about child-to-parent violence and aggression is offered to all parents, people in the assessment stage as well, and people are encouraged to attend that and hear the stories from the people who are experiencing this. Because these statistics suggest that we almost need to consider this as a developmental issue, as something that you may experience. We need to move away from the idea of, oh, what if I'm the rare person who is going to experience this, to, no, this may happen. This child has had really difficult experiences, and this may be something that is going to come up in your family. I really like the idea of the screening for trauma for parents, because I think a lot of the interventions that we offer need parents to be co-therapists, need parents to be very regulated. But we need that first step. We need to see where parents are without judgment. And I've certainly seen lots of parents who show signs of being very traumatized by incidents. One of the modalities that I use is EMDR, which is a trauma processing approach. And I've certainly offered EMDR to many parents to help them process some of the big incidents that they've experienced.
Raising awareness, being aware that, the child's behavior might also have an effect on the parent, and that to an extent where they might need help, additional support, maybe trauma therapy. And what do we do about child-to-parent violence? So what are the techniques? How should parenting be different for these instances? Is there an approach that you use?
I advocate a child-centered trauma-informed approach. And the way that I look at it is that the child who expresses their distress through violence and aggression is no different than the child who expresses their distress through maybe hiding under a table or crying. The emotions are the same, but the expression is very different. So that very kind of child-centered, high structure, high nurtured, and nurture form of therapeutic parenting, I think, is really helpful. But so much more difficult for the parent, so much more demanding for the parent when you've got a child who expresses themselves through violence and aggression. Because if you've got a very withdrawn child, a very sad child, a very scared child, we feel naturally empathetic towards them, and we're drawn to them. We want to make it all right. We want to do that nurture. But if you've got a child who expresses their distress through hitting, biting, saying really hurtful things, breaking things, our brain's not drawn to that. That's not the child that we really want to go to. So I think even though the principles are the same, parents who are doing this kind of parenting need so much more support. Just those reminders that this is not your fault. It is not personal. This is not a bad child. Also, it's developmental. Because parents, and I really liked that you mentioned that in your study, Morvwen, this worry about if this is what the child's doing now, what is it going to be like in the future? Parents need that reminder that this is a developmental issue. So what we're seeing now, we're not going to see exactly the same in 5 years' time, 10 years' time. We don't know what we're going to see in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, but what we do know is it's not going to be exactly like this. The child will develop, they'll grow, they'll mature. To me, parents need lots of support to do this. And I think for the children, we need to be very creative in what works for them. A lot of the time, there's so much shame that it takes a long time for a child to even be able to talk to a therapeutic practitioner about what they do when they get angry. So we need lots of time and really move at the child's pace, and probably also include lots of body-based sensory type stuff. It needs a very holistic kind of approach, in my opinion.
Morvwen, can you remind me, what was the age range of the children in your study?
There was a really wide range. So it was one of the limitations, I guess, is it's not kind of in a particular demographic. It definitely went up to 22. I think it was very young, maybe kind of 5-ish up to 22. So big scope for the children.
And was your feeling that the experiences differed depending on the age range? So was it different for, in adolescents versus kind of smaller children? Don't know whether you looked into that or whether you remember.
I guess we didn't look directly into the kind of different ages, which would be, I guess, a really, really important research question to keep going with. But kind of developmentally, I guess, the fear that parents were feeling when their children were older, so kind of adolescents, for kind of 5-year-olds, was different experiences. But I guess the themes came across throughout all interviews. So that fear, that sense of shame, of judgment was something that kind of consistently came up for parents who parented a 5-year-old, 6-year-old up to 22.
So basically starting early and already telling, educating prospective adopters about it, that this is something they can expect, to kind of reduce the shame when it appears, to kind of create the sense of you're not alone in this, there are others, and there's something that can be done about it. Also, I've kind of heard there's more to come from the wider project. Is that what's to come? Can you give without spoiling the surprise? Can you give us a teaser?
I can give teasers. So we're writing up at the moment the quantitative data that we have. So that kind of looks at some of the prevalence, the rates of trauma for adoptive parents, and these were all adoptive parents. So it wasn't a selected sample like in the qualitative study, and that's where we found kind of 10% reaching that threshold for PTSD on a screening measure. And we found that a lot of those symptoms of PTSD, a lot of those scores were predicted by the current challenges, so the child's parent violence, more so than the child's past. The extent of the adversity in the child's history was one of the real big kind of findings for us from the quantitative data, which will be to come soon.
Interesting. And I forgot to ask, is in your clinical practice, are you confronted with the topic of child-parent violence as well?
Yeah, so within adoption, absolutely. Currently, I work in a forensic team. So this is working with children and adolescents that are on the edge or in criminal proceedings. So some of that might relate to violence, violence in home or violence outside of home. So in a slightly different context, but yeah, definitely coming up within different populations and different groups.
So overlapping. Hetty, from what I understand, you're also giving workshops on the topic?
Yes, I do. I talk to parents, I talk to professionals about this. Yes, I feel very passionate. I think often maybe in social work it's been seen almost like a specialist subject, but I feel very passionate about getting the idea out there that this is not a specialist subject. This is something we all need to talk about, and we all need to be able to work with.
Was it the Adoption Barometer from Adoption UK? I think I want to say last year, maybe, or the year before. Can't quite remember, where the topic came up, and I think around 68 or so % of parents said, well, they experienced child-to-parent violence, and I think about a third said it was in the top 3 or in the kind of top of the problems they struggle with, I think. If I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think that was my understanding as well. And then we have the research, Julie Selwyn's research from 2013 on adoption disruptions, that also showed very clearly that in that third of parents who said that they were really struggling as a family, that child-to-parent violence and aggression was a big factor in that. And I was very interested to read your study, Morvwen, thinking, well, this is an updated, because that study's it's over 10 years old now. That's still what we're dealing with, isn't it? I think we have to remember that child-to-parent violence and aggression doesn't just happen in families looking after care-experienced children and young people. It happens in all sorts of families, but the prevalence does seem to be higher in families that we're talking about here today.
I think that's a good point, that it's not something that only happens and we're talking about elevated risk, right? It's not like you adopt a child, this is something that will definitely happen, right? This kind of deterministic view, but it's just, well, the child has risk factors that make it more likely that this may happen. And if it happens, there's support available that you can seek out, right? And then also, if it happens, it's not a reflection of you are a bad parent or you're a bad adoptive parent, but it's an experience that other adopters also have.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. I thought I was also really interested to read, Morvwen, about how many parents experienced a delay in support or lack of support. And of course, the Adoption Support Fund has made therapeutic support so much more accessible to so many more families. But it's a lengthy process. And I have to say, in my in my experience, lots of families who I start working with have been waiting about 6 to 9 months from first making that call to say, we need support with this, to then sitting in a room and talking to somebody who's hopefully going to help them. And that's a long time, isn't it? And in a child's life as well, 6 months in a child's life is a very long time. So I was very interested to read your recommendation that support needs to be put in place much more quickly. And I would absolutely agree with that.
Moving away from those kind of this being something, a niche subject, to being something that's more widely available, I suppose. And because, Hetty, you mentioned adoption breakdown, is that something that was mentioned in your study, Morvwen?
Yes, I think there were a few adoptive parents who their child no longer lived within the family home. And I think that links a lot to Julie Selwyn's studies that you mentioned there, Hetty, in the experiences that these families are having in the home and how challenging it is for parents, for the child, and for everyone at home, that leading to breakdowns. One of the research studies that inspired this whole project was with Matt's previous study in foster carers, and he looked at kind of similar aspects of secondary trauma, of indirect trauma for foster carers' experiences, and he found that predicted foster care placements breaking down and children moving placements. And we don't have the data for adoptive families, but that real, I guess, impact of the child's trauma, the parents' or carers' trauma, and then leading to breakdowns in placement, and the impact that then has on a child and the parents as well. A real vicious cycle.
And I think it might be also helpful, I'm guessing, to break stigma as well, to get the message out well, if we kind of help parents tackle child-parent violence, that actually might reduce the risk of breakdown, and then actually, is also then beneficial, obviously, for the child, kind of the further down the road, right? So if we they're kind of intertwined in a way, right? And if we it could also be this kind of cascading or developmental cascade, where if we stop it early or kind of prevent it then we might prevent things like adoption breakdown and much more severe negative consequences down the line, right?
I often say to parents that it's a little bit like if you have an empty jug yourself, that you can't pour from an empty jug, and in that way it's especially important as parents to look after yourself, your well-being, taking time to do what fills your jug up, so that you're able to pour from that, which I think is really, really important to focus on the parents' experiences, their mental health, their well-being, so that they are in the best place to then support the child's mental health too.
Yeah, I think that's a nice metaphor to think about it.
I think it's also important to remember that, there is, I see lots and lots of families, where there's real transformation, who live in this really difficult situation, but with support for the parents, with support for the child, things get much, much better. I think we also, whenever we talk about child-to-parent violence and aggression, we also need to mention that, that things do get better for many families. It's really sad to read, when I saw that top age in your study, Morvwen, that parents of 22-year-olds, that is really sad, isn't it? But we shouldn't think that everybody who's dealing with a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old who expresses themselves through violence and aggression, that they're still going to be seeing this when the child is in their 20s. For many, many people, this is something that passes. This is something that they're supported through or that the child works through. So I think we do also need to hear that message of hope.
I feel like those two statements, the filling up your jug and kind of the self-care aspect, and also kind of this hope, there's hope, and it, can get better, and this might be temporary, and there's something that, can be done about it. I feel like those are very lovely kind of final statements, maybe to finish up on, also with an eye on the time. So thank you so much for being part of this podcast. And obviously we're happy to put any links that are important, for instance, links to the book, but also other links you might find important. We can put that under the podcast so that people can find more resources if they would like to do so.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Corranbath Conversations. If you'd like to know more or listen to earlier episodes, visit corranbath.org.uk.